Okay, so let's get back to our diagram. We have these ideas that are stacking up. And by the way, this whole warehouse here of ideas has a name. Anybody have an idea what that name is? This whole warehouse of ideas. It is the product backlog. Thank you. Yeah. This whole section is the product backlog. Product backlog is owned by the product owner. They do what's called backlog refinement. Okay? If you're doing some research and you see somebody talk about backlog grooming, it's the same thing. Just kind of a new name, but backlog refinement. And refinement means that they're worried about splitting, sizing, sorting, sequencing, because they want the high value items to be sent to the build team first. Okay? Now, Dee mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to tell you right now, this is part of the secret sauce of what makes Scrum work and why we can make claims like Jeff Sutherland did, where we can do twice the work in half the amount of time, is because studies have shown over and over again that 80% of the value from the backlog is in 20% of the items. 80% of the value for the stakeholders in 20% of these items. Think about Microsoft Word. Think about all of the features that you can imagine that might be in Microsoft Word. What percent do you actually use? Probably pretty small, you know. That's that 20%. And so what this product owner will do is try to mine those 20% that are the high value stories, feed them to the team first. And what we end up is what we call a steep value curve. We get value early, that's the difference. The waterfall value came very late, and only one time at user acceptance testing. We push value very early and get it in front of the customer, in front of the stakeholder, so that they can see and they can inspect, and then we can adapt. Okay? And then what sometimes happens, this is quite common, is that this is why Dee talked about maximizing the amount of work not done. We don't want to do all the backlog because we know that a good chunk of those are delivering not much value. So when we get it in front of the customer, they see it, they give us feedback, and then they say, you know what, some of these things that we thought were so important, you know, in the very beginning are not so important after all. And we do what's called trimming the tail, that is cutting the project where we don't do some of these things that are nice to haves. Maximizing the amount of work.
Question on that.
Yep, yes, please.
So is that the mindset change that people have to get into, that just because it might be good for my area, something is in the backlog? Overall, we want to look for more bigger bang for the buck, and we're going to lose out sometimes on getting certain things done.
Yes, an element of that would be true. Let's hope that as we're building this product, that it will add value to all of us as a corporation. That would be our hope. But some of that may be true. And let me tell you a little story about that. This goes back to the product owner. I started the story about the anti process where we had 3 product owners. And so finally we discovered that this was not a good thing. And we went and got some more training. We got a different coach. And we picked one that we thought really should have been the product owner. And this individual turned out to be one of the best product owners that I had ever seen. And this kind of gets into your question here. We would always go out to the sites that are in a release and try to show them I'm talking about Polaris now, the 3M blueprinted solution, and have them respond with areas where they see gaps. Okay? And early on, the sites would have an approach where they kind of bring all of their requirements and say, these are the things that we need for Polaris to be for us. And this product owner was out at a site visit, and the one individual was saying, here's something that I need to have in the system. And she would say, well, why do you need to have it? And say, well, it was in the system before this one. Well, why was it well, it was in the system before that one. And it's kind of like, it ended up being something that in fact was a defensive mechanism to a defect in an old system. Had no value any longer, but it was carried forward because it was part of the process. It was part of their defined process, you know what I mean? And it's kind of like the story about the daughter who was baking the roast, and it's like, mother would cut off both ends of the roast, and she'd say, well, why do you do that? And she'd say, well, my mother did. And mother cut off both ends of the roast, why do you do that? My mother did. Turns out the mother didn't have a pan that was big enough, you know what I mean? So it's like, so we discovered there was no value. The product owner said, no, this is not going in a global system because it has no value. It doesn't add value to the corporation. So it was no, and it didn't go into the backlog. Does that help? I hope that helps. Okay.
Question.
Yes, please.
Who determines critical path for a project?
Who determines the critical path? Okay.
Critical path is you have an idea, you have a project, you start and an end. Sequential things must happen to get to the end. Certain things can happen out of order, but certain things cannot happen out of order, or you have cost slip and schedule slip. So someone has to know what the critical path is.
Right, and that's kind of what we're looking at here, is the critical path. We're just getting started here. So maybe let me get through this, and we'll revisit in just a minute if that's okay. Okay, so this idea, this is the backlog. Now, we have here a stop sign. I call this a stop sign. Okay, and this stop is an event. And this event is called the sprint planning. Okay? Sprint planning is right here, happens here. Sprint planning is owned by the product owner. So this session is about roles. I want to keep talking to you about the product owner so you get a sense as to what this role is all about. But they own the sprint planning. Sprint planning has two deliverables. One is to define a sprint goal, and the second is to determine which of these items from this product backlog should be fed to the build team in the next sprint. Now, that has a name. It's called the sprint backlog. Okay? So, and I represent it this way. This would be the cargo in this truck here that's going to be delivered for this sprint to the build team. That happens in the sprint planning. You set a sprint goal and you determine which of these backlog items should be populated in the sprint backlog for delivery in this sprint. Okay, we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow. Okay? But these items here from the product backlog are delivered as an input to this factory, story author, and output of this factory here would be stories that have two things. One, they have acceptance criteria. Anybody have any idea what acceptance criteria is?
Reasons for making it move forward, or some of the value.
Yep, that's, go ahead.
Way to prove your deliverable.
Yep, that's it, exactly, right. It is those features that are necessary in order to call this done. So if one of these was a form, say, maybe it's maybe the application that we're building is some kind of a name and database of people and people interested in a product. So maybe this would be a form, maybe it'd be a search form. And acceptance criteria would be first name, last name. You know, it would be those things on that form that are required for the stakeholders to say, yeah, we can use that. That's the acceptance criteria. The features. Yes?
Is that the same thing as a definition of done?
No. Definition of done comes, when it comes out of the build team, definition of done is more like a standard of care. Has it been tested? Has it been, you know, did we use, let's see, did we do a code review with our team? Did we do proper design documentation? Has it been tested? Both maybe integration testing as well as unit testing. It's kind of like the checklist of things that are required in our standard of care. It's more of a quality measure, okay? But there is something called definition of ready that would, you know, these stories coming out of this factory, they must meet two things, the definition of ready and the acceptance criteria. We will go over all of these more tomorrow. But the definition of ready is things like, has this item been estimated and is it achievable in the sprint? So we ask this as a checklist, we ask these questions to ensure that we have stories that we can deliver and that we have consensus within the team that this is a good thing to go forward with this story. We'll talk about this a lot tomorrow. We spent a whole session on sprint planning. But acceptance criteria is the features required. Definition of ready is this checklist to make sure that everything that should be, that it's clear, that it's testable, that it's has been estimated, and it's achievable. Those are the kinds of things that we're interested in the definition of ready. Okay, so those stories must meet those criteria when it comes out of here. They're loaded up. We call this cargo the sprint backlog. It is delivered to the build team, and they start sprinting. All of this happens before we start sprinting. Okay? At 3M, there's a lot of 2-week sprints that happen. Doesn't have to be. In infrastructure, sometimes we know that there's a lot of unplanned work that happens. So in order to try to make sure we get a window where we can work on planned work, sometimes we shrink the window down and make a sprint 1 week instead of 2 weeks. But it could be anywhere from 1 week to 4 weeks. That would be considered acceptable within the framework of Scrum. But for software development, it's 2 weeks. And once we start sprinting, we have another event that we do. And anybody know what that is? It's a daily stand-up meeting or a daily Scrum meeting, right? We'll talk about this more. We got a whole session on daily Scrum or daily stand-up, but this is part of the transparency is that every single day, in fact, I was a few minutes late coming in because I was running one of the daily Scrums for one of my teams this morning. But generally, we go around the room. We use Jira to do this. Jira is a great way to do it because we can see all of the stories that have been committed in the sprint backlog, and we can see all the people that have tasks assigned to them, and we can go through individual by individual and say, how's it going on this task? And they say, oh, I'm talk to you about for a while about how it's going. Do you have any impediments? Is there anything that's keeping you from your commitment to deliver this in this sprint? Every day we do that. And that's the daily stand-up meeting.
There's a question from online about what about inspection? Saying that that's an activity during the sprint. I don't know what that is though.
Here, just inspect and adapt? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So these are what we call the pillars of the empirical process control. And this is the foundation of Agile Scrum. Okay? It's the kind of the lean thinking. It's kind of the whole business of we believe that things will change in the process of our project. Therefore, we want to periodically inspect where we're at, what we've done, the value we've delivered, and show it to the stakeholders. And we expect them to give us feedback, and we will adapt to that feedback. Does that help? Okay. Okay, so we were talking about the daily Scrum. We're sprinting because we had the sprint planning meeting. And once we sprint every day until we are complete. We've been through 2 weeks. Then we output something called, and I think you've heard this term already once, a potentially shippable product. Now, we've had discussions in these classes before about potentially shippable product. Some people get a little hung up on the terminology, but the reason we call it potentially shippable product, I like to think of it like this. It's like a wedding cake. If you imagine a wedding cake, a very big one with multiple tiers in this wedding cake. And maybe when we sprint, this build team is the baker, and we have a sprint that says, I want you to make one column, because there's 3 big columns on this big, tall wedding cake. And that's one sprint. It's an increment. It isn't the product, that's the whole cake. But it delivers value. We could sell it if we wanted to. It really does have value. You could eat it, but it's just a column. Okay? So that would be a potentially shippable product. Okay? Now, we've got to introduce another role. This is our individual over here. called the Scrum Master. Okay? Now, if the product owner is outwardly focused, the Scrum Master is inwardly focused. Okay? The Scrum Master has no business talking about what we should be working on. They are all about how. They want to see this team, this build team, become a high-performing team. They want to make sure that we're delivering on every single sprint commitment. They are all about listening for impediments. Okay? Now, one time when we were having our daily stand-up meeting, we had a good scrummer, the Scrum Master, this was many years ago, and we're having these daily stand-up meetings, and everything's going great, and the development team, for me, the development team is spread throughout the world. At that time, it was primarily in India, in the India Development Center in Chennai. It is now in the GSCs in Costa Rica and the Philippines. It's spread around. So we do have some challenges there. Time zones is a challenge, especially when we're meeting every single day for a short meeting. But at any rate, so we were having our daily stand-up meeting, and the development team was doing great. They were coming to every single meeting, giving us good, input as to how things were going. And the one day, only one person showed up. And it's like the Scrum Master's like, wow, this is what's going on. So I talked to this individual, and Chennai had a 100-year flood, and the development center was 2 feet underwater. So that's an impediment, right? And we have impediments. Some of them we call blockers. Some of them are things that we can deal with even within the team. Scrum Masters love to see when the team deals with their own impediments, like, I broke a laptop or whatever. Those are smaller things, but being 2 feet underwater is a pretty big deal. So the Scrum Master did exactly what Dee talked about here. He escalated this to Tier 2, and they escalated it to Tier 3. We use tier structures, but some in the white robes of Scrum, and Scrum talks about Scrum of Scrum and Scrum of Scrum.